So you have to unmute yourself, David, once I mute everyone.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Here we go.
Excellent.
Okay. Okay. Right. Good afternoon. So this is intended to be a general look at moving away from Linux desktop. Basically, it will cover the why I decided to do it and what I did as a next step, and then how I did it. So Linux wasn't a foregone conclusion, as will maybe come out as I go along. So what I'll try and do is sort of give an overview of the three aspects to the process I went through, but then go into a bit more detail. For example, talk a bit more about what Linux is and some of the apps that I use and so forth. Okay, so first of all, the why. Well, so the context is that in the household, my wife uses a Windows PC. She uses Office apps. She's not an experienced user, but she is learning. So she's gradually becoming more able to resolve issues herself. My son is sort of the next step on that. He does that and also does gaming. So he can use the PC, but he wouldn't be able to manage it. Okay. I'm reasonably experienced in desktop computing. My career was in telecommunications and computer science side of things. So I'm not really an IT person. And then there's, in terms of work and hobby, I've used a range of hardware from laptops to desktops to microcomputers, mini computers, and I dabble in electronics, robotics. So I'm quite technical in that sense, but I wouldn't be able to write a web page, for example. So there's a distinction between computing and IT in that sense. So in our household, and actually the wider family, I'm the PC applications network and peripheral support person. The issue is that I have to plan for what happens now as things change around us, but also for the future. I mean, what happens when I'm not around? You know, they still have to be able to use the PCs and so on. Okay, so that's a bit of context. Going on to the why, the most recent aspect is I got an email from Microsoft. So I use an email client application, Thunderbird, which then interfaces to various email providers, one of which is Microsoft Hotmail. And they sent me this email, basically, because my current app was only using username password to log in, I was going to lose all access to my Hotmail account unless I made some changes. And the change they were mandating was to adopt their modern authentication method. So it had to be an authentication that was acceptable to them. And of course, they would push an approach that would benefit them the most. So they want my phone number so they could send me SMS, but then they have my phone number so they could do more marketing and so on. So it's now at the point where not only do they demand you have a Microsoft account when you want to install Windows, now they want my phone number as well, my mobile number. Now, there are workarounds and I can do the workarounds, but neither my partner or my son would have any idea what to do about this. They would just comply with whatever Microsoft said to them. And to my mind, this is a form of entrapment. Okay, and far from acceptable. So that's one of the strong whys why I want to move away from Microsoft.
Ray, did you want to ask a question?
Yes, please. Are you saying that Thunderbird will not support the authentication requirements that MS require?
It will, but you have to go in and make the change. So basically, you change from basic authentication to OAuth 2. and then it will use multi-factor itself, but in a way that Microsoft finds acceptable. The trouble is if you follow the help text on how you change that authentication method in Thunderbird, it won't actually let you change to OAuth 2. You have to do something far more devious to get it to accept that change. So as I say, not only do you have to go in and change configuration parameters within the application, that it doesn't even support that change itself, and you have to find another way to do it.
Oh, I thought it did it automatically.
The normal
but,
user.
Yeah, I thought it's automatic, but
It's not automatic.
okay.
Okay. So that irritated me a lot. But really the one that made me take the step of abandoning Windows completely was Windows 11 and how it arbitrarily they've decided to arbitrarily obsolete a bunch of very usable hardware. It's not just a small amount; it's like a lot. And they claim it's for good security reasons. Okay, so you've got to have a TPM module or a capability to support TPM like functionality. But I've got a lot of hardware that just won't. Even though some of it has got TPM, it won't support Windows 11. So apart from the obsolescence issue and what I see as invasive practices, I also find that Microsoft changes too much, too often. I have no control over when this happens. So even the change from Windows 10 to Windows 11, how you access some of the control elements to configure how Windows behave, it changed radically. I couldn't find where to make some changes that were directly accessible through the old control panel. And then finally, there's a lot of focus now on AI, and that means there's even less control. And I don't find that acceptable. And the PC is supposed to be a tool. It's supposed to be something I use to do something, not a semi-autonomous partner that decides I may like to do something the way it wants to do it. So there was this combination of reasons that I saw as final straws that really made me make the move. So I decided I want to move away from Windows. In terms of time, I had 2 PCs that needed replacing, so I had to come to some sort of decision. But the issue is, okay, move away from Windows, but where to? I've got a lot of PCs, desktops, laptops, servers. So there's a cost aspect. I mean, a lot of those are not new. I like to reuse hardware. So I had my previous business, I used secondhand laptops. And they were like £100 each on eBay, and I'd refurbish them myself and then use them for the business. I don't want to have to then spend £100 for each one just to put Windows on. I know you can get it cheaper, but again, the context for this is it's not really me, it's my wife and son who are having to do something. I want control over when I upgrade and what changes that I make. I don't want that decided by some company who figures it's found a new way to monetize my use. The other element is the trend towards software as a service. So you now rent an application, you don't buy it. And worse than that, you now rent your data. So the issue around not being able to access Hotmail was suddenly I would lose access to my data. So I didn't find that acceptable. And then just personally, I want to move to lower power CPUs. So I see ARM as a good direction. And if it's not ARM, AMD are quite good in this area as well. So I also therefore need the operating system to be configurable, less bloated, and allow me to use low power systems. So I think the basic problem I'm fighting against then is the supplier of the hardware and or software really wants to monetize things. So they're the greedy corporation. This happened on an application I use quite a bit, which is Autodesk Fusion 360, which is a CAD package. They started making radical changes and I left them. I found an alternative. So I've had to do this a couple of times. I'm not a stranger to this, but I still have to decide on behalf of someone else. It isn't just what I'm capable of doing. Okay, so moving away from Windows, the key decision really isn't the operating system, it's the applications. The user uses the apps, the OS is just part of the platform that runs them. So in looking at a replacement, I have to be able to run certain applications. I don't want them to be rented. And so Google is an option with Google Docs and Google Drive, but again, I'm renting the space and the apps. I don't want to do that. It turns out that the general Office applications, browsers, media players, and so on are available across platform. They're quite easy to get hold of. And we standardized, for example, on LibreOffice some years ago. So my wife, although she runs a Windows PC, she uses LibreOffice as her main Office apps, and she uses one of the free browsers. Specialist apps, typically on Windows, some of them are on the Mac. Relatively few are available on Linux, but that situation is improving, and I'll come to that close to the end of the presentation. Another aspect is that gaming is a key area. That's a concern I have to address because my son is a gamer, and that kind of knocks macOS out of to the bottom of the list. Although that's changing, because literally yesterday I saw an article where Apple have now decided they're going to try and support games in a big way. So the whole thing may change again. Okay, so what kind of apps are we talking about? As I said, we've got Office applications. Most of these are available as open source free packages. There's gaming. That's a whole big area. I'll come to that. And then for me, I do a lot of development in terms of 2D and 3D CAD, but also computer science type applications. So it's programming, FPGA electronics, and so on. So I'm interested in some specialist applications. So all of these need to be supported on the eventual platforms. Okay, so what can we move to? So at that point, so this is November last year, I saw there being 4 potential options. There was no single perfect solution, unfortunately. So one option was to simplify just to tablets. That's perfectly doable. You could use Google Docs for the main Office applications. It'll run all the media, all those types of applications, fine. But the data is in the cloud, and there's no support for gaming. And of course, it doesn't address my issue of development. The next step on then from tablets. I'm sorry, by the way. The family already use tablets and Android phones, so that's a low cost move relatively. The next step on then is a Chromebook, which is basically a laptop that uses Google Docs, for want of a better summary. That kind of seems like a dead end to me. Why not just have the tablet and put a keyboard on it? And also it too is too dependent on the cloud. Okay, so next alternative is the Apple Mac. Now, this is quite attractive to me because it's a move to ARM. They have moved to, for some time, they've used ARM-based processors, so very good energy usage, but they're very, very expensive for what you get comparatively. But on the other hand, they're very good for the support. Better for support than, for example, Windows, because we have an Apple store in the town. And all the apps that family would want to use are on there. but I don't know if Apple are any less invasive than Microsoft, to be honest. And I would wonder about whether I would need to change the tablets and phones over to Apple from Android. So at the time, the Mac didn't support games in any meaningful way, and so that really wouldn't work for my son. So there'd have to be an alternative for that. And then for me, there are problems with development workflows, for example, supporting the tool chains for FPGA development. So then the fourth option would be Linux. I already use it on some of my PCs, laptops, and servers. The usability, I think, is approaching the Apple Mac. I mean, it's certainly not there. And there are problems running some apps and games. The biggest problem, if you're looking at it from a sort of like a household perspective, is that it doesn't have very good support at all. I mean, you go online, it's a bit of a minefield trying to get help if you've got a problem with Linux. So it needs a level of expertise to understand how to deal with issues, and also you need to be able to access the non-standard environments like Discord and Reddit and so on. Okay, that's basically a repeat of what I've just said. Okay, so I'll pause there and see if there's any question or comment anybody has. No? Okay. So in this, I had to be the guinea pig. And so this is the set of hardware that I had to deal with. I had a desktop PC that I built, and that was running Windows 10. And this was one of the PCs that needed replacing. It was too old, too slow. And if we were going to continue with Windows in the household, then I needed to put Windows 11 on it. Because by this time, my wife then had a laptop running Windows 11. So I needed to be able to sort of run into problems before she did. My main laptop ran Linux, a flavor of Linux called Popos. I was running that flavor because it has good CPU power management, which I wanted for the laptop. I also had a notebook, a Mix notebook, it's like the Lenovo equivalent of Microsoft Surface. That was supplied with a Windows, but I then got rid of that and put Ubuntu on it. The business laptops I mentioned, they all ran Mint Linux, which was another variant of Linux. One of them I'd reinstalled Ubuntu on to drive the laser cutter in the workshop. And then I have another laptop, which is dual boot. So it can boot either to Windows 10 or Ubuntu. And that's a just in case for if my wife's laptop fails. And then I got a bunch of servers. So I do 3D printing and run a Octoprint server, which runs on Ubuntu. I've got a file server running on a Raspberry Pi. And then I've got some X enterprise desktops that I use for development. More on that later. So that was the situation in November. So I already had experience with Linux, mostly as a server, but also an amount as a desktop user. Okay, so I needed to dip a toe in the water as a desktop user, a full-time desktop user. And there are various ways you can approach this. So the first one is to use what used to be called a live CD. Basically, you have an installation of Ubuntu, or the Ubuntu installer image can be put onto a USB stick. You plug it in and boot from that, and then your PC or laptop is running the Ubuntu. You haven't got rid of your Windows environment or anything, and it's quite safe in that you're operating solely within that booted Ubuntu environment. It's not accessing a disk. So it's quite useful if you want to try things out, but it's quite limited in what you can do. You can install some apps, but only as far as the amount of RAM you've got in the system, because it's not going to write anything to your disk. So that is quite useful. However, the issue with this is you need to be able to get into your PC BIOS to enable you to boot from a USB stick. And it may not be set up to do that. And so that's something the user needs to know how to do. And it doesn't always work, as I'll cover later. The next step is to run a virtual machine, which Peter is going to cover in far more detail next month. So basically, one of the virtual machine environments you can run on Windows is called VirtualBox. It's now owned by Oracle. It's very easy to use, and this is the main thing I actually use to try apps, Linux applications out. And basically, you end up with a window which acts as your Linux machine. You can run other environments in there, but I was running Windows. So you're running an application in a Windows environment that's actually, sorry, in a Linux environment that's actually running on your Windows system. And you can access USB devices, and you can access parts of your disk storage that you configure. So this is quite useful. However, it's quite slow. So then the next step is to install the Linux on a separate device. And then what you can do is access that Linux system using a local desktop. So it's a Windows remote desktop, and it's using a standardized protocol called RDP. So the Linux is on a PC box. It doesn't have a screen attached. You connect to it using an application window on your own PC. The problem with it is response time. So it can be quite slow. You get a lag. And if you're wanting to do demanding applications like games, then it doesn't really work that well. So it allows you to get a feel for what fairly standard applications are like, but not anything that is very demanding for video. Okay, and so the last one then is to find a spare laptop or desktop, and I had lots of those. So I ended up putting Linux on my main laptop, and that's what I've been using for probably up till May, I think. Okay, so I use VirtualBox and then various PCs and then the laptop. Using the laptop and remote desktop also solved this problem where if you're running the system on a separate desktop, you've got to switch displays and keyboards, and that could become messy. So another advantage of using a virtual machine is that you avoid that, because you're not using a physical display, you're using the window on your main PC display. As I say, I set up the laptop. It's a laptop, and this is quite a high-end laptop. It was a Intel i7 running an NVIDIA graphics card, and I set that up with a variant of Linux called Popos. So there are a lot of variants that are called distributions, and I use the Popos distribution because it's very well suited to the NVIDIA graphics processor that I had on that particular laptop. And the reason I targeted that device was because I needed to try out the gaming to see if gaming was viable, because that would be important to my son. And I could also then try out some specialist applications, particularly the electronics and development tools that were very heavy on graphics. However, some applications that I use on Windows aren't available on Linux. So you have to find workarounds. So you could look for a native Linux version of the application. If there's no Linux version, there is an environment called Wine, which emulates Windows on Linux. And you can try running the application in Wine, or you can look for alternatives. And what's happened over the last couple of years is that a lot of alternatives to standard Windows applications have been developed. Okay, so we were already mostly using open source apps anyway, so they're available cross-platform on the Mac, on Windows, on Linux. We use LibreOffice, we use the standard browsers. For graphics, there's Inkscape, GIMP, Krita for 2D. I never used Outlook client on the PC, on Windows. I've always used Thunderbird client on Windows, and I could carry that over and use it on Linux. If you use VPNs, and NordVPN, which is a very popular VPN system, it works on Linux. It doesn't support the full GUI version. It's command line only, but it's basically the same product. You get the same level of support and capability. Most 3D printing applications are available on Linux. I use a number of paid for applications, for example, Lightburn, which is for the laser cutting, and they provide a version for Linux. So I was able to carry my license over. However, one example is I use another graphical application, and I had a license on Windows, but they wanted me to then buy another license for the Linux, for the Apple Mac environment. And I wasn't prepared to do that, so I just found a completely different alternative. And then there are a range of applications that will run on Linux, but they do so because they actually run in containers, like mini virtual machines. And this applies to a lot of applications that are not open source. So what happens is the developers, they take the Windows version and they put it inside a container that can then run on Linux. And that applies to WhatsApp, which is a messaging service, and Discord and so on. And then finally, there are alternatives. You have to find some alternatives for other applications. So I have a Dymo label printer, and Dymo has its own application, which doesn't run on Linux, wouldn't run in Wine, but it turns out that the open source GNU label supports that printer perfectly adequately. So I went with that. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so on the question of alternatives, you can't, so if you're going to run on Linux, you can't avoid it. You have to find alternatives to some applications. What's interesting is that Adobe recently had what you might call a Ratner moment, in that they've basically cheesed off a lot of their users who are now looking at alternatives. And I came across this map of alternatives by someone called xDanielArt, and the web page is down there. And for each Adobe application in their stable, he then identified available alternatives. And so I don't know if it's clear. So for example, under photography, the first one he's got is something called GIMP, which is an open source application. And that runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Okay, so that's the key to reading this. So for then the Paint app, Photoshop, you could use GIMP, but you could also use Krita, which is another very popular painting app, and that's available on everything, on certainly Windows, the Mac OS, Linux, and Android. I don't know if it's available on iPad, which I guess is what iOS means, but there are other tools available on iOS. Okay, and he's gone through for every Adobe application and identified a useful list of alternatives to look at. Right. Yes, Affinity Designer was the alternative app I was looking at before, and you see it doesn't have a Linux version. All right, so there's the website. You go on there if you want to cast Adobe Adrift. Okay. Right. Now, it turns out that some applications that I needed to be able to run, or the household needed to be able to run, would not run on Linux natively. I couldn't get them to work on Wine. So therefore, what I did was get an Apple Mac Mini to try them on the Apple environment. And these are the four key ones that I needed to look at. So all the Lego Mindstorm software, if you're a Lego fanatic, then Mindstorm software doesn't work on Linux, but it does work on Apple. Bricklink Studio is another Lego application. These two sets are free, that you don't pay for these. Cameo Silhouette is a paper cutter. So it looks like a printer, but it cuts patterns in paper. And they have an application called Silhouette Studio, and I couldn't get a run on anything, but I paid for it. And so fortunately it was a multi-platform license, and I could get it to run. I could download a version for the Apple Mac Mini. And then finally the Affinity Designer, as I said, that won't run on Linux. I couldn't get it running Wine. But in the end, although I got the Mac, I didn't elect to pay extra for the license. I used something else instead. Okay, so that got me into the Apple world. And you'll see that I've had to use the Apple for something else unexpected. So that's quite useful. Right, okay, so that's the Apple. Okay, gaming. So we've looked at the Office type, the general user applications. So the next big item was then gaming. Well, the answer to this are two things. One is Steam. So Steam is developed by Gearbox. Steam is a service, if you're not familiar. They provide a catalog of PC games that you pay for and you can download from there. It's all digital in the sense that you don't get a DVD with a game on. It's all held in the Steam system, and you download and install it when you want. Gearbox, who own it, develop it, have spent a lot of money and a lot of man hours developing some middleware called Proton. So this is, if you like, an environment that will run in Linux on which the game runs, and the game thinks it's running in Windows, but it's not. It's actually working through the Proton middleware and using the Linux hardware and software. The vast majority of games that I've tried work without any issues at all using Proton. It's a very simple two-step process to install the game from Steam on Linux. The other alternative is another provider called GOG, and basically they maintain a catalog as well, just like Steam do, but they also have Linux versions of various games, so you can download a Linux native version of some games. So those two basically address the issue around games, because the majority of games that are used here are Steam based. And the other advantage then is that if we didn't go with Linux, then there is a Steam Deck, so there's still a way to run all these games independent of a PC. So this kind of solved the gaming issue. So that was two of the users in the household are covered. Right, so we could go to Linux and found solutions to them. Okay, so the current progress at this point was my partner's on a Windows laptop, but I found ways in which all the apps that she uses could be run on Linux. My son uses the same apps, but also does gaming, and there's a workable solution there. But he's also interested in moving to Linux. So that's a possibility with the Linux laptop. I haven't used Windows for 7 months. Okay, so amongst all of this, I then built another PC and I've just run it with Linux from scratch. And I use Popos or Ubuntu for the majority of my work. I have the Mac Mini, which I use for exploring different apps, and there's one piece of functionality that I have to use it for that I'll come on to. And then for sharing data amongst ourselves, we use Google Drive. So no USB sticks are used here. Everything operates through Google for sharing between the tablets, the phones, and all the PCs. Okay, now, so we'd addressed my wife and my son's requirements, but I'm sort of the outlier in that I've got a lot of different systems, a lot of different software. So this is where I started in November, and then now I'm at this stage. So I've got a new PC which I built, and that's running Popos Linux. The old desktop PC I had was Windows 10 up until around May, and that was there as a backup. But that's now running Ubuntu, and I use that as a development machine. My main laptop is still Popos Linux. My notebook is still Ubuntu. I now have an Apple Mac Mini that runs a couple of apps. And the rest is more or less as it is, except I've kept the dual boot laptop in case my partner's laptop breaks. Okay. So I had two options. I could go to the Mac or I could go to Linux. So I guess one question is, what's the attraction of Linux? Okay, it's not Microsoft and I have control over when I can do things, but there has to be more to it. So if you compared Linux to Windows, I guess the major difference is that Linux is modular, whereas Windows is monolithic. You have no choice over the window management in Windows, really. You can't separate the Windows management from Windows itself that easily. In the case of Linux, it's actually, I guess, 4 major chunks. You've got the kernel, which is the low-level operating system. You've then got a set of libraries and utilities, which is called GNU. It's the GNU library, and that's what makes up the Linux system itself. And then this is packaged into distribution with a set of applications, and there are a lot of different distributions. And there's a website called distrowatch.com where you can go and see what distributions there are if you're really that keen. And then on top of the applications, for it to become a GUI environment, a desktop, you then have a window management system, and then you have the desktop environment. Okay, so my PC runs all of those layers, if you like, at this point. But it can still act as a server. Okay, I could run it it can run as a web server. It's actually a multi-user system. And so you can have multiple users using my PC at the same time I'm using it as a desktop. Okay, so you've got the server part, which is the kernel, the GNU, and then the package of applications. And you can access it as a server using SSH or web protocols or FTP. For it to be a desktop system, it needs a graphical shell. As I said, that involves a window management system and a desktop environment. And unlike Windows, all of these can be changed. You can install new desktop environment, new Windows management systems, and you can, when you log into the system, you can select which of those you want to use for that particular session. Log out, and then when you log in, you can use a different one. You can do it. I tend not to, but you can do it. But it does mean you've got a lot of choice, and it can be choice based on your taste, your aesthetics, or it could be that you need something that adapts to the capabilities of the platform. So if you've got a low power device like a Raspberry Pi, it's not got as much in the way of resources, processing or memory or storage as a large desktop it has. And so you ideally want to set up the environment to suit that restricted set of resources. So you've got a range of window managers. The underlying window management system was called X Windows. Most systems are now moving over to a new system called Wayland. You may see that name crop up. Frankly, you won't really see much of a difference between those two. It's basically a layer that's used by the desktop window apps, and it typically won't impact on an individual user. You're more likely to be impacted by the desktop environment you use, and as I listed, there are a set of flavors. To give some idea what they look like, we'll have a look at my system. So as I mentioned, I'm using, whoops. I use, okay, so this is the distro I'm using. It's Popos. Now, Popos is based on Ubuntu, which is a very popular distribution. And Ubuntu has a version called 2204. There's a later, more recent version, but Popos is very conservative. And they're using what's called the long-term supported version of Ubuntu at version 2204. So that's the operating system I'm using. This shows the kernel that it's running on, and there's various other information. So this shows my hardware configuration. I'm running 64 gig of RAM, which sounds a lot, but it means I don't have to have a swap partition, which simplifies use of the disks. And if you do 3D graphics and CAD, you tend to need a lot of memory. Here it is showing elements of the desktop environment. So the environment itself is called GNOME, and the window manager that's running on top is called Mutter, and it's running a particular theme. Now, all of this is configurable. You can change all this to suit your taste. Okay, not much else there. Okay. So these are some of the environments. You can see that at first glance, there's not a lot of difference, but typically the desktop environments either follow Windows type style. So for example, these two here, LXD and Ubuntu Mate, or Apple Macintosh. And so Enlighten, and I think this is Awesome. It's a desktop environment called Awesome. They're very Apple-like. Okay. I can't remember what this one's called. And this is Mint Linux, which again is a very Windows-like environment. So if someone's moving from Windows to say Linux, you could start them off with a very Windows-like desktop environment. And then once they're familiar with Linux type apps and utilities and the way of doing things, they then have a choice. They could go to a Macintosh-like environment without actually having to pay for an Apple. Okay, so this is on my system. The image at the top is of my desktop. So this is Popos, and as you can see, this is MacOS down below. They're very, very similar. So Popos follows very much the MacOS theme and approach. So a very clean environment. Both of them have docks. I could move this dock down to the bottom, but I find it better over on the left. The system information on MacOS is up here. Sorry, yeah, and it's the same up here as well. Menus tend to work differently in Apple compared to Windows and Linux. So for example, if you start an application and it puts a window up, the application's menus are still at the top. Whereas with Windows and Linux, the applications menus are always at the top of the application window. It's the system menu doesn't change at all. So that's one bit of difference with an Apple that you have to get used to. Okay, so that's my desktop, if you will. And here's a set of applications. So this is sort of very similar to what was the Windows Start menu in Windows 10. So these are all very common applications that I use, and you can change which applications are on your dock as you want. What is different from Windows and the Macintosh is that you're not constrained to using overlapping windows. If you find it too messy and you find you keep losing windows, then you can, this menu icon up here allows you to switch to a tiled window mechanism, and basically rather than windows overlapping, it rearranges the desktop to have them all at the same level. If you're doing anything extensive, particularly in development coding, you can run, the windows can get very small very quickly because you have a lot of windows. So I tend not to use tiled display, but it can be useful in certain contexts and for certain people, and you have the choice. Okay, right. So just to run through what you would see in the typical environment, it's a GUI desktop. So you have a way of looking at the files in your storage system, and you can look at it either as a textual list or as a set of icons, and it has the notion of folders and files, just like Windows does. You also have a way through a menu off the system menu to get out the settings for your system. So you can change the background, access the timer, and so on. I tend to find it a much simpler setup than Windows. I kept getting lost with the Windows settings. And you have to go to different places as well. You can't do everything off the Windows setting window. Whereas most of what you need to do in this desktop environment, you can do off the settings window, sorry. Okay, so that's files. Right, now, the thing about Linux distributions is it's not just the operating system or the desktop environment. They come with a lot of applications. I mean, a lot of applications, and they're all free. And the way applications are managed in Linux is with what's called a package manager. So Popos, which is what I use, is a variant of Ubuntu, which is a distribution based on Debian. And the Debian package manager is called APT. There are other base distributions that use different package managers, but for the type of Linux that I use, the package manager is APT. You can use APT from the command line, but this is a graphics desktop, and so there's a graphical application to access it, and it's called the Pop Shop, which is this little icon here. And everything's graphical, so you can search for and look at the various applications. If you click on one, it then gives you a bunch of detail about the application, what resources it needs, and you typically have a button to install it. So this is the Ubuntu way. Ubuntu knows about various sources, and it collates all of those sources into the application shop. But it doesn't stop you downloading installers from a whole variety of sites. So someone may develop an application and they don't make it available to Ubuntu, and you just download it directly. I tend to find that a lot with development packages. Now in the Apple world, I think this is called, certainly in Android, it's called side loading, and Apple doesn't like it. They want applications to be signed. So they exert a lot of control over what applications you can run on your Apple computer. That is not the case in Linux at all. In fact, not only can you download an application from anywhere, not just the recognized package manager, you can download the sources for the application and compile them yourself. So there's a lot of freedom and choice again in Linux. Okay. Now, okay, so you get the application, you've installed it. What happens if there are changes? Well, sorry, I go back. So you'll notice this hamburger-like menu here, icon. It's got a number 2 in a circle. That says there are updates outstanding and available. So if you click on the hamburger, you get a drop-down menu. You can look at updates. And this is what you're presented with. Basically, these are all the applications that are installed. It tells you what version they currently are, and if you click on them, you can get information. And it also lists what updates are available. So this is Okular is an application, and I can update it just by clicking on update. I can get more information by clicking on the eye. But there's also an operating system update available, and I can update that. I don't think I've had probably one update in the 7 months I've been using this. One system update that's required me to reboot the system. But the rest of them, and there've been a fair number, I haven't had to reboot the system. It applies the update and then just carries on. And this is an aspect of Linux. It's designed as a modular system, and a lot of the functionality is implemented as modules, which can be dynamically loaded. So, for example, if you plug in a printer, the driver is a module and it just dynamically loads it. You don't have to do much. You certainly don't have to reboot the system to recognize the driver. And so it's not only is it quite robust, you don't have to take it out of service a lot. Okay, so your application is installed and it's up to date. So there's another icon on here. It's basically the application launcher, and this is like the Windows, what do they call it? Start, Windows 10 Start menu. You get a bunch of icons and you click on it and it'll start an application, and you can organize these into categories. You create your own categories, which is what I've done. But from here, you can see it's got the standard browsers, for example, a couple of weather forecasts. Thunderbird is an email client that I use instead of Outlook. There's PopShop, which allows me to look at new apps. This is Google. This is Contacts, and it's linked to my Google account, so I manage my Google contacts from here. Okay, and if I want to change any settings, I could access the settings from here as well. So in some ways, it sort of looks a bit like Android if you use an Android phone. Again, it's a set of icons. Okay, so you can run applications from here. So as I mentioned, the main Office type applications that we run are from LibreOffice. So this is like the Microsoft Office 360. So you've got a document processing, word processing, spreadsheets, charts. So this presentation was done in Impress, LibreOffice, which is like PowerPoint. So all the basic stuff, same basic functionality, and it's free. Although you can donate, and I tend to donate to some of the main applications that I use. So that's the Office type apps. Media players are plenty. So video, I use an app called VLC to run that. VLC will also do audio playing, although there are audio players. So for example, there's Audacious, which is an MP3 FLAC player. So media is well served in Linux, and there's a lot of media creation tools as well. Okay, so the area I tend to do most in is 2D, 3D graphics. For 2D, I use Inkscape, which is basically vector graphics. I use it for CAD. In this case, it's being used to design a SVG file for laser cutting. So it creates SVG files, and then that is passed to this application called Lightburn, which then manages the laser cutter to cut that design. So 3D, there's Blender. Blender's very popular for doing movies, animated movies. That was what it was originally developed for, but I use it for CAD. And so I use it for designing, again, for laser cutting, but I can design it as a 3D object and then convert it to 2D shapes, and those then get passed to laser cutter. I also do 3D printing, so I can do CAD on the design. It's a slightly different way of designing to a traditional CAD like Autodesk. So this is all the designs that I've done on this object, all in one file, in one place, and I can move them around and what have you. So I don't have separate files for separate versions. They're all in one place. And that can then be converted to a format for 3D printing. Okay, if you're into development, basically it's pick your poison. So I do some development on the Raspberry Pi Pico, and there's an app for that development environment called Thonny, and that's available as a native application on Linux. That's here. If you're into games development, there's an environment called Godot to do games development, but you can also get Unity or Unreal tool chains as Linux native to run on here. Most of code development I use VS Code, which is running here. And most of my development is either in C or Python. But I don't run the development tools although they're Linux native, I don't run them on my desktop because I don't want to pollute my system. Because it'd be very easy to break stuff, because a lot of the desktop environment relies on Python. So what I do is I run a virtual machine. So I run Ubuntu inside a virtual machine, and then I access it using VS Code running on my desktop, and I do development that way. Okay. And here's an example of running another tool in a virtual machine. This is doing development for FPGA. So an FPGA is it's an electronic device that it's digital electronics, and you can create CPUs and GPUs and what have you, digital elements in it. And iStudio is a tool to work with a particular flavor of FPGA. And this is running in a virtual machine. So this is similar to VirtualBox, but this isn't VirtualBox. This is an unconstrained virtual machine system running on Linux. So it's Ubuntu running in a virtual machine on Ubuntu. Okay. Right. Okay, so that's kind of where I got to and how I got there. The whole process was very iterative, so I haven't gone through all the iterations I went through. But as I went through this process, what I did was I captured notes, because I went down some blind alleys. Some things worked, some things didn't. Some things needed a lot of tinkering to get working, and so I basically captured notes on how I did all that. If anybody is going to try and make this sort of change, I heartily recommend doing this, because 6 months after you've done it, you'll forget what you did. Right, so okay, that was keeping track. I'm happy to share some of this if people want to try and follow the same path. Okay, so I've got to a point. I've been using Linux as my desktop instead of Windows for about 7 months. I haven't felt the need to go back to Windows at all. I haven't had to use it as a backup or because something didn't work. I was always able to solve a problem, but there have been issues. So the first one is secure boot. So BIOSes now have a piece of functionality called secure boot, and it's basically to ensure that people don't boot up malware in place of a legitimate operating system. The problem is that it only allows recognized operating systems to be booted up, and the only recognized operating systems are Windows, surprise, and Ubuntu. But Popos, which is a variant of Ubuntu, isn't recognized, so I couldn't boot it unless I turned off secure boot. So to be able to even run the live drive, which was Popos, I had to get into BIOS first to allow me to boot from a USB, and secondly to turn off secure boot. And then normally you install Popos, go back into BIOS, turn secure boot on again, and then boot up and everything's hunky-dory. But not with Popos. With Ubuntu that works, with Popos it doesn't. And so I couldn't get Popos to run on my Mix laptop, the notebook, but I can on my my laptop. So there some BIOSes vary in what they permit. So not everything is the same, and it requires experimentation to find out what you're able to do. So in this case, although I wanted to run Popos on my notebook, I had to instead run Ubuntu because that did work. Right, the next problem is graphics cards. One of the most popular graphics cards for gaming is NVIDIA. Actually, it's one of the most popular cards if you want to do AI as well. But NVIDIA cards can be a problem because they don't provide open drivers. And so you have to wait for NVIDIA to produce the drivers for the Linux distro that you're using before you can use any of the features in the NVIDIA card. Popos have an NVIDIA specific distro, so they put a lot of effort into making it compatible with NVIDIA cards and keeping it up to date, which is why I went with Popos initially, because my first PC had an NVIDIA card. AMD cards are a doddle because the drivers are open source, and typically they're integrated into a distro, and I've never had a problem with my AMD cards. And that's what I'm using in my latest PC. I don't know, Intel have decided to get back into GPUs, and they do some quite nice GPUs now, but I don't know how they are with Linux. I don't have any experience of them, and I haven't looked into them yet, but I might well do, because I quite fancy using Intel instead of NVIDIA if I can't use an AMD. Finally, that you have chipset GPU. So if you get a low-end PC, or typically a laptop, it will use a graphics processing unit called 9GP. It's integrated into the supplied chipset. It's designed by Intel, and those are typically okay. They'll run with all Linux distros. Okay, that's graphics card. Scanners. So one thing you need to be able to do generally with a desktop PC is do some scanning. Now, there are lots of applications supporting scanning, and some of them are really nice. They include character recognition. So they'll do character to text recognition automatically. So there's some really quite nice ones, but they don't all work. I haven't got them all to work with my scanner because it's part of a multifunction printer, and that printer's quite old, and it took a bit of work just to get the printer recognized by Linux. So I'm not sure where the problem is, whether it's the app or with the multifunction printer, or how I've set things up in the Linux, or the network even. So I'm having to replace the printer, and maybe things will work out more easily with that. If I pick up the last point now, although a lot of things just work, printers don't just work. I have a network color laser, and that won't work with Linux at all. Whatever I try, I haven't been able to get it to work, but it will work with Mac. So there's nothing wrong with the connection to the printer or the printer itself. And Macintosh, which is a Unix, has no problem with the printer, but for some reason my Linux distro does. So I'm going to have to be replacing that. But there are a couple of brands that are recognized as being very friendly to Linux. And they always provide very good support for Linux. And those are HP and Brother. Unfortunately, well, what I want is a tank-based inkjet printer, and Brother don't do those. HP do, but I don't trust HP because they're not very consumer friendly. So replacing the printers is a bit of a minefield, and that's the thing I'm going to step into next.
David,
Yep.
a bit surprised on that one because you know, I use a Mac now, and Mac uses CUPS under the cover for printer access, which is written by Apple, and of course CUPS is presumably what you're also using on Linux. So I'm just a bit baffled why you would see the difference if they use the same software.
So printers still use drivers, and those drivers are provided by the device manufacturer. So my color printer is from Dell. I'm not sure what the OEM manufacturer is. It recognizes the printer, but what it can't do is that I can't find a driver that will work with CUPS that will work with that printer.
The CUPS comes with drivers.
Yeah, and it even recommends a driver for that printer, but it doesn't work. The problem is these printers are too old.
Okay.
Yeah. But as I say, I mean, it's not. See, the other aspect with printers is that for quite a while, they were designed for Windows specifically. And so you have holdovers from those days. So they may have made an accommodation for Apple. So Apple may have a driver that's not generally available. Anyway, I'm replacing both of them. So I'm going to have to try and find printers that work with Linux somehow. Okay, so coming back up here. So some Windows apps will run on Wine, but it's a struggle using Wine. So it is a compatibility layer, and yeah, you can do it, but just finding out where it stores the data, the application data, so you can access it, can be a struggle, because basically a Wine app is a containerized app. So it pretends to be a small Windows system, and somewhere in there is the data that you're working with, but you can't always get at it from outside the app. And also some apps just won't work with Wine, which is why I had to look at Mac as an alternative for commercial apps. From the user perspective, again, in the context of the household, it can't be overly complicated. You can't rely on a Linux expert. I think there's too much of a variety to do with application installation and management. And I'll cover that in the next chart. So there are at least four different approaches to it. Games are easy peasy. No problem with that. And USB just works. You plug in a USB device and fine, it'll work. Unfortunately, any apps associated with that device might not, which was the case I had. So I've got I do some amateur radio, and I use a software-defined radio piece of hardware. It uses USB. You plug it in, the system recognizes it wonderfully, but I can't run the app that then uses it. Fortunately, this is about 10 months later, they've now produced a multi-platform app that will run in Linux. So I'm going to try that at some point. But again, that's something to be aware of. Okay, right, package management. So in the beginning, there was this package management called APT, which managed what are called .deb packages. They're Debian packages, which basically just specifies the format of the package, and a package is going to be the application and data that specifies what that application is dependent on, so that when you install say, I don't know, say you install LibreOffice. If LibreOffice is dependent on a whole set of libraries, then what APT will do is check you've got the libraries up to the compliant version so that that software will run. So typically application management is very clean and easy with APT. Ubuntu are moving away from APT to something called Snap. And there's a similar kind of setup called Flatpak. And these are containerized apps, which contain all the dependencies within them. Okay, so you would just install a Snap. It's a single entity. It doesn't involve changing any of the other software in the system. It's all contained within that single package. The difference between Snap and Flatpak is Snap, it can be used for anything. It can be used on servers. It can be used for the GUI applications. It can be used for terminal applications. And in fact, there's Ubuntu Core, which is a version of Ubuntu for IoT devices. And that's solely Snap based. There's no Deb or anything. It'll only work with Snap components. One of the drivers for Snap is that because it's a container, the commercial application providers can use it to incorporate libraries that are not open source. And therefore you could run like a fully commercial application on an open source environment and they're not breaking any of the licensing. And that's how you can run Zoom, for example, I'm running Zoom. It's a commercial application. It's not open source, but it's not using any libraries in Linux. It's all within the container. And so that's a large driver for Snap. Unfortunately, a drawback with Snap is that the applications are very big, and so it takes a longer time to load up compared to like previous APT packages. This isn't an issue with servers because you'll load an application, it'll run for months. It's more an issue for desktops, but really with the move to solid state disks, you don't really notice the difference that much. And then the final flavor is AppImage, which is available now. And basically that's another container type package, but it's one that doesn't install. So you don't have to do any updates to it. Whereas with Snap, you do have an update system. But the drawback with this, but also the advantage is you've got all this choice, all the flexibility. You're not constrained to just one scheme that has been monetized by one provider. And so there's a lot of protection to the user because of this. And speaking of protection, one thing I haven't talked about is malware. So you can get anti-malware packages. For example, this eSetNod32, which I don't use, but you can pay an annual fee and put it on your Linux system, and it will do virus checking and what have you. And there are others. The ESET is the most popular apparently, but I don't use malware, anti-malware. The theories to date have been that only 2% of desktops run Linux, so they make a very poor target for malware, because malware is typically about either controlling things or getting money, right? Blackmailing people. And that Linux is less vulnerable to malware anyway, just by the nature of it's mostly open source. There are a lot of eyes on things, on the software. If you use the Pop Shop or the equivalent Ubuntu application shop, it's via control. It's a controlled environment. The thing is, though, this 2% argument falls flat on its face because the whole internet runs on Linux. I mean, the world is dependent on Linux. And so I think Linux is actually a prime target, not a poor target. However, as a user, I do have an alternative, which is I could run the web browser in a virtual machine. And that would then isolate it. from the rest of the system. Now, having said that, although that's something you could do, that's not something a normal household user could necessarily do, but it may be where things are heading with snaps, for example. So that'd be a runtime container that would then limit. Okay, so after all of that, what's the direction we're going? Well, we're moving all the gaming to Linux. And there's the option to consider a Steam Deck if that's the kind of thing someone wants to try. Having seen how we get on with Linux, they'll then consider whether moving all the general computing over to Macs or to Linux. I also need to find solutions for file sharing and printing that the rest of the household can manage. It has to be easy to set up. You can't have all these driver problems that need a lot of workarounds. And that's true for a lot of other things in Linux. It needs to be very simple for users to use and manage. So what I might do is consider moving them over to Macs, particularly when they do a refresh. But then the phones and the tablets, which are currently Android, may be an issue. Don't know about those. And that's my lot.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. So any questions? I've got a question in the chat here. I don't know if you want to start with that, David, or maybe you've got some questions, put your hands up.
Yeah, hang on. Right, chat. Okay. Others will go to recycling. What would you recommend for a simple external bootable OS and also an HDD wipe software program that will run off the external device? Ideally, both will fit on 3.3. I would avoid floppies. I would just use a memory stick.
Yeah, I don't think the device I've got, it's so old it won't use a memory stick. And I used to have all the tools at work, unfortunately, but I've been doing a different career for the last 10 years or so. So
right. So
starting
sorry. So you've got a very old.
We've inherited, and we need to data that's on.
So
yeah,
you've got a very old.
It hasn't got any ports or drivers other than a floppy interface, one of them, and we need to get personal data off it. The only other way I can think is to take the hard drives out and take an angle grinder to them.
Yeah, I would do that. It's not worth keeping the old drive.
Sorry?
It's not worth keeping the old drive.
They're all boxes. They're big and bulky. They need to go. But I used to have access to all the software and all the expertise, but it's now 10 years old, I'm afraid, and I'm retired, so I don't have access to all the the legacy tools I used to have.
Yeah, I typically, with hard disk drives, I typically dismantle them, take out the silver disks, scratch them, and then use them as bird scarers.
Yeah, that was one option, actually, just to maybe put a sanding disc on them and then dent them a bit and get rid of them in chunks.
Yeah. So the other thing you could try, what I would try is if you can use a USB to boot, I would just put Ubuntu on it. And so if you put the Ubuntu install image on it, you can boot that and it acts as a live disk. So you're running Linux, but you can then look at the disk. If you want.
So I should be able to wipe.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you should be able to.
It then doing it that way. I have got one or two of the old laptops I'm going to repurpose, not get rid of.
Yeah, the whole point about the live disk is that you can install from it, and part of the installation is to completely wipe the disk. But given if they're quite old, I wouldn't necessarily stay. So if they're that old, they're probably IDE interface actually. So you'd be hard pressed to find a replacement.
Yeah.
If I could give a comment on that one as well. What I've done with OPCs is got one of these, which is an external drive, and you can plug in different types of hard disks into it, SATA and IDE disks, plug it into your desktop and then erase it from there, and then get your angle grinder out, whatever you need to do. The problem
you can get adapter cables as well, which would do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, what are people using as whiteware these days? Because there is some personal data on there I need to get rid of before I repurpose the discs. And I know we used to have stuff to hand at work in the office, but I don't know what people are using these days that does, 10 overwrites with random data or whatever.
I can look up what I did, but I remember there was two techniques you could use. Some of the drives support an erase command, which you can send to the disk, and then the disk sits there whirring away, erasing itself. Other disks didn't support it, in which case you have to, override it a few times. But yeah, there's absolutely loads of Linux tools to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's something called dban. And if you do a search, so the main thing is that it's no good erasing the data. You actually have to overwrite it, and you have to overwrite it multiple times.
Yeah, I get that. Yeah, or encrypt the disk several times and throw away the keys, the decrypt keys. But
yeah, you could do that. I mean, there are free utilities to do that.
I was wondering what was recommended before I start putting on something like Ubuntu as an operating system or something like that.
Right. There's Partition Manager will do it for you.
I want to start off with a fresh install, and know there's nothing personal on there, and I can just put on whatever I want then after that point.
Yeah, but the thing is, although you may only have a few files, you're going to have to wipe the whole disk because.
Yeah, I don't mind that. See, one of the issues is, and you touched on this earlier on in your presentation, there are some websites and some places I need to go because it's how other people work their lives, Facebook being one of them, that I don't want on my personal devices because of all the tracking cookies and everything else. It's an absolute nightmare to be able to access those sites without polluting your system. So I'm not talking about dodgy sites in terms of building hand grenades and things like that. I'm talking the sort of stuff most of my friends do. Say, oh yeah, well, you need to look at this news, or you need to look at this, or you need to look at that. You're not getting information. People are even coordinating, kayaking trips and things on Facebook. And I don't want to do that on my main device, but it struck me that repurposing a device as a completely clean but then dirty device, I don't care what happens to it, whether it's a virus or whatever, I can use it for stuff like that. And I don't really need high performance either. It's just going to do web browsing, really.
So you could do a couple of things, but basically you'd be using it. You could either run a virtual machine on your main device, and within that, you then run the browser.
Yeah, I don't want to use the resources for that though.
Okay, so
I'd rather use a separate device.
Okay, so then the next step would be a separate device where you're running, say you run Ubuntu on it.
Yeah.
Now, if it has a screen and keyboard, fine, you use that, or you you run a VM on that and then run the browser in the VM. Or you could run it as a server, and then there's an application called Remina on Linux, which is equivalent to the Windows Remote Desktop Manager. So it allows you to connect into that separate device and act like the display keyboard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the sort of thing I've done before, but decades in the past,
I believe, yeah.
I thought I'd ask you to
like,
get up-to-date stuff.
It sounds like the key to what you want to do is virtual machine. So perhaps something to pick up with Peter's presentation next week.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Adrian.
You mentioned that you were looking for software to run scanners, or I wondered if you'd looked at ViewScan.
Yeah, that's a paid one, isn't it?
Yes, but it's not very much, and it goes across all systems. And I'm not sure they've changed it, but it was. I mean, I got ViewScan 20 odd, nearly 30 years ago. And I've been updating it, and I've run it on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So, once I paid my subscription, my one-off payment, which wasn't very much, it is probably better than any of the other scanner software that I've found. So that was just a thought.
It is. It's my backstop. I was aware of it. I mean, there are three that I'm sorry. I'm just going to look. It'd be a bit odd because I'm looking at me. What have I got? So the ones I'm looking at the moment, there's one called Document Scanner. Where are you? So there's G-Scan to PDF, and the other one is then called Xane. So those are three I'm currently looking at. But I'm not going to take the plan. I'm not averse to using paid for software. The issue for me is not the fact you pay for it. It's how controlled you are once you've got it, basically. So yeah, it's something I'll look at, but only after I've replaced the printer, because I may have no problems at all with the replacement printer.
Okay. As far as printers are concerned, I ran an Oki color laser, or it's an LED printer actually, for 20 odd years. And that was fine. Then it eventually did physically die. I had been refilling the toner cartridges with toner from an outfit called U Refill Toner, the letter U Refill Toner. And I spoke to them because I think they recommended, that if I wanted to change, that a Brother laser was the way to go, because they, again, they supply the toner, and they seem to be very reliable. And I got a Brother, and I have been doing so, and it's very good. Now, I don't know how well it works with Linux.
No, it's so, as I just said earlier, the two brands that are recommended for Linux are Brother and HP. But Brother has a very good reputation for reliable printers.
I think if you make sewing machines, you probably have to be able to make intricate things that work, and they're for women a lot. I wouldn't touch HP. I bought an HP ScanJet in 1999, and it wouldn't support Windows 2000. So within 1 year, they basically abandoned it. And actually, that's when I got ViewScan. So it's 24 years ago. And that just solved the problem. And of course, it works with so many different scanners, and you don't need a driver for it.
Yeah.
Ian.
Thank you for that.
Oh, you're muted, Ian. Ian, you're muted.
That's it, yeah. Apologise. I've been brought onto this by a friend of mine in Newcastle who's actually on this system at the moment. And the reason he passed it to me is over the years, I've used Linux since Red Hat in the 1990s, all the way through. I've tried every variety of Linux. I've ended up with OpenSUSE. And nowadays, I'm actually getting people with old laptops which can't run Windows 11, giving me the laptops. And what I've been doing is using a program called Nuke, which fills the old hard drive with zeros right the way through, and it cleans the hard drive off completely. Then putting OpenSUSE on, which is a very simple, straightforward, but very grown up, I should say, way of doing it. By comparison, Ubuntu, I think, is very complex, I'm afraid to say. You're talking also about printers. I've set up the 5 that I've done, which is mostly for people in our age, my age group, which is the retired people who want something straightforward. They want to be able to do word processing, see pictures, do a bit of music perhaps, and had no problems with it. They've taken it on after using Windows, and within 5 minutes, they haven't even had to ask me a question. It was so straightforward. Printers are the only problem I've had with printers. Every variety of printer I've connected to, HP, Canon, Epson, the whole lot, I've had no problems whatsoever with any printer, except the one problem Linux has is it's no good on Wi-Fi printers. It requires specific Wi-Fi apps to run, but plugging the printers wired in, no problems whatsoever.
So is that USB connected?
USB connections, yes.
So my printers are all on, they'll be TCP, they're all Ethernet. So I've tried Ethernet and also Wi-Fi for the color one. Now that might, I haven't tried USB, that might be the answer, but then I've got to, I've got to find a PC that will then be on all the time that people.
I've found with OpenOffice, with OpenSUSE, that you plug a printer in, it detects the printer's there, immediately disappears, comes back, found the driver, plugs in, and then it's up and running.
Right.
And that includes the scanners.
Yeah.
So if you've got, as I have, with 2 Canon scanner all in one, it sets them both up. And the beauty of the OpenSUSE is the desktop is a very simple, straightforward desktop, rather like the original Windows XP, actually.
Okay, right.
And everybody just built it.
SUSE's long established. It was one of the very early ones in the early 90s.
Yeah. Oh, Red Hat, yeah, worked all the way through. And as I say, I've done this at least 5 occasions to various people, and they've settled down very, very quick.
What about the housekeeping side of things? So, because people need to back up their data, I mean, are they able to do app upgrades and things like that?
Well, that's simple. I mean, OpenSUSE, when there's updates come, you get a little box at the bottom says updates available. You can either dismiss it or accept the updates, and they normally take about 5 to 10 minutes, and that's it, done.
Yeah, it's the same with Ubuntu. You get a notification. The problem with Ubuntu is that they are trying to promote the use of Snap.
Yeah.
But the update process won't work with snaps.
Nah.
So you have to then go to a command line interface and interact with the Snap store and do it. So it's not fully matured enough, I would say, yet for
it's quite
general use.
Another thing with the OpenSUSE one, similar to Ubuntu, it's called Discover. And Discover, there must be hundreds of programs on there, apps available. But yeah, just sort of pop in. As I say, there's other people waiting to come on.
Right. Okay. Well, no, thank you for that. That's very useful.
Roger.
Hi, can you hear that?
Yep.
Interesting. Thank you, David. There's massive coverage of a massive everything, my whole life kind of thing. I'm really very interesting. Just you sent us down one little alley, and I think you alluded to something that Peter might cover in future, which is to do with VirtualBox and virtualizing lots of things.
Right.
Back in the day when I was doing serious things with real work that paid me money, I needed to keep a package that ran on Windows XP. Yeah, it was actually Quicken, if some of you remember Quicken. It was an accounts package. And then they pulled out, and I needed to keep it running. So I kept it running on VirtualBox for ages. I ran it on Hyper-V on Windows for ages. And today I put it on Proxmox.
Right.
And I would encourage anyone that wants to, that enjoys the hobby side of this and wants to do things in that world, I'd encourage people to have a look at Proxmox. Firstly, it's very well covered on YouTube tutorials. You take one of your old discarded PCs or laptops, you pop a USB card in it, and with the installer ISO on it, and you install perhaps on another USB, or you could install onto the hard disk itself. But you need to leave yourself a bit of space, and on that bit of space, you start installing all your favorite distros. So you could you have like a kind of a tree structure, and you've got one thing and it's called Windows XP. You have another one called Mint. You have another one called Pop-Off. And you have, I have one called Cups.
Right.
And Cups runs some very old printers. Some very old printers are just running even with parallel ports. One of these printers has a parallel port with a USB connector to it. And Cups is, you know, I don't mess with drivers and things like that. It runs on that thing, and it just gets that out of what used to be my hair. Have a look at that if you haven't already, because it is huge fun. And if I can put it like this, it's a kind of God mode on your computer. Yeah. In the sense that you can hop between these different OSs and you can run containers. So one of the containers I run is called Frigate, which is a security camera app. I run Home Assistant, which is again a virtual machine that runs under Proxmox. And my goodness, it's kind of huge fun and a hobby, I think, in itself. Anyway, that's my lot. But thanks again for what you said or back there.
Actually, you've reminded me of something. One useful thing I found. So typically if you're not using Proxmox, so if you're installing it on your main PC, if you like, you'll use an installer on a USB that typically can act as live CD or an installer. What I use is something called Ventoy, VENTOY, and that makes it easy. Basically, all you do is you copy the image onto the into the USB stick. You don't. Otherwise, you have to sort of set up an installer on the USB. With Ventoy, you don't. It acts like a disk, and you just pile in the images, and then when you plug it into the laptop or the desktop and boot up, you can then pick which OS you want to install. So Ventoy, certainly, if you want to go just single desktop route, then Ventoy makes it a very easy process. But yeah, I had looked at Proxmox. That might be project lifetime number 2. Project lifetime number 1 is to try and find a solution for a desktop solution actually for the others. But I agree that if you're running a lot of ancillary systems, then Proxmox is probably definitely a good way to go.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. Just one thing. People mentioned printers. A lot of people use Wi-Fi printing these days. I've got an old HP printer, actually. It's not in use at the moment, but I'm going to need to print some things soon. I've just moved house. Does anybody with a network analyzer know if the comms from your box to your printer is actually encrypted or not? Or is it just going, as I might expect, being an old printer, plain text over Wi-Fi, in which case you don't really want to be printing bank statements and things?
when I last looked at that, printers these days support multiple protocols. They may not advertise it as such. IPP is the standard network printing protocol. But my printer, for example, supports FTP and a whole bunch of other sorts of protocols for printing. So I would guess your Wi-Fi printer actually supports multiple, but IPP would be the default, which isn't encrypted, I don't think.
Yeah, that's what I thought, because I don't think I get a choice of any protocols when I last used it, which was some years ago, but I've probably time to get a new printer, I guess.
But wouldn't the IPP be over a tunnel over an encrypted connection anyway, as it's Wi-Fi?
Well, it depends what the Wi-Fi is, whether it's using Wi-Fi direct or I know what you're getting at. It depends how you configure the Wi-Fi connection, doesn't it? Because you can print direct from phones and things. But that doesn't always need Wi-Fi. You can use Bluetooth, and I'm assuming again that the default, particularly with AppleSoft, is that the comms to any external devices are encrypted. But I don't have a way to prove that at the moment because I don't have.
So if you go onto cups.org,
what? Sorry.
cups.org.
Yeah.
It specifies, so the IPP, that's the Internet Printing Protocol, specifies that the connection should be encrypted using SSL.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question, I think, is yes, but the drawback is it's SSL, which is an old encrypted link.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But oh, sorry. The other thing is that the printer has to request it.
Yeah.
So it's
you
need to check on the printer.
Given all the other things HP tried to do with cloud printing and all sorts of other stuff when it was first set up, I'm beginning to wonder. I think I might send it back to where it came from. Actually, it's a legacy thing that came over with a divorce and a house split. Probably get a new printer might be the best way.
Okay. I've got a comment, unless anyone else has got a comment here. I think, David, you've got a lot more patience than I've got. I gave up on Windows over 20 years ago, and almost literally threw it out of the office window. I used Linux for years and years and years, all sorts of distributions, Gentoo and OpenSUSE, as someone mentioned, all sorts of stuff. Recently, I've because my colleagues at work mostly started switching to Macs, which is Unix desktop really. I did the same and find it much easier. But the comment I've got here is when I watch people use Windows, I'm utterly astonished how many workarounds and bits and pieces you have to do. And my wife's still working, and when she works from home, it's the next door room, and the screams I hear from the office, I have to close my door to to hear her shouting and screaming it. And I just find Macs and Linux so much simpler than Windows, and all the workarounds you have to put in, and you have to work the way Windows wants you to work rather than you work the way you want to work. And the other thing I was going to mention is, you didn't mention this, but again, I'm astonished about the number of adverts you get on Windows now. I mean, an operating system is there to support you working, not to sell you stuff. So my big comment is, I'm astonished people use Windows now.
But people don't know of an alternative, right? And I was an Apple user in the mid 80s, right? So I started with an Apple II, and I was then using the Mac. And Apple got corrupted, right, the same way Microsoft has got, and so there's a danger they may go the same way. So I'm not absolutely certain, based on my experience, that Apple won't be become the bad guys just like Microsoft. I mean, I was constrained to using Windows by my work, and it was only really when I've played with Linux since the early 90s when Slackware came out. But it was, when was it, 2012, when I started doing workshops. And because I had all these secondhand laptops, I wasn't going to pay for Windows on each one. So that's when I started using Linux desktop. And it had changed quite markedly in the sort of the 10, 15 years since I used it. What struck me was how close they try to be to Apple in usability, which I think is a big plus. I also think it's a big minus. I think there was an opportunity to go in a direction, for example, that suited the first-time user, right? The novice user that didn't require any awareness of things like networking. Apple gets close. It's much closer than Windows is, than Microsoft is, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's there yet. Right? And it's a shame that the Linux groups didn't try and do something fresh, something new, right? And pick on a user population that wasn't best served by Windows or Apple, for that matter. But we are where we are, and I think probably the trend to try and emulate the Apple usability is very much a big positive for Linux desktop at the moment. They need to clean up their act on some things. That, for example, the installation isn't as usable as it could be. But yeah.
Okay. Any other comments from anyone else? So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to skip August and then in September, I will almost certainly have a talk on containers, virtual machines, Kubernetes, and so on. So thanks very much for coming, and I shall post an update with the recording as soon as I can. So thanks again to David for sharing his time with us. We do appreciate that.
Thank you.
Cheers, David.
Okay.